Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads. Ukraine is losing ground, and Trump wants to negotiate. So let's begin this historic journey. I'd like to invite you to subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming content on history and geopolitics. On February 24, 2022, the world awoke to a reality many believed belonged to the past, a large-scale conventional war in the heart of Europe. The Russian Federation had launched what Vladimir Putin termed a special military operation against Ukraine, a conflict that would quickly reveal itself as the largest military confrontation on the European continent since World War II. However, to truly understand the roots of this devastating war, we need to go back decades in history, examine the complex relations between Russia and Ukraine, understand the Soviet legacy that still permeates both nations, and analyze the geopolitical tensions that have gradually accumulated over the years. This is not a war that arose out of nowhere. Its origins date back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, passed through the Orange Revolution of 2004, intensified dramatically with the Dignity Revolution and the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and culminate in the full-scale invasion of 2022. It is a story of conflicting national identities, contested spheres of influence, promises made and broken, and imperial ambitions that persisted beyond the end of the Cold War. Over the next few pages of this narrative, we will explore every aspect of this conflict with depth and historical rigor, from its earliest causes to its most recent developments, including the major battles, the leaders who shaped its course, and the humanitarian consequences that continue to affect millions of people. Historical roots. Ukraine and Russia through the CNTURES. To understand the current conflict, we must first examine the long and intertwined history between Russians and Ukrainians. Ukraine, whose name can be translated as borderland, has occupied a strategic position between the West and the East, between Europe and Russia, for centuries. Its history as an independent political entity is complex and frequently contested, especially by the historical narrative promoted by the Kremlin. Kievan Rus, a medieval state that flourished between the 9th and 13th centuries, is claimed by both Russians and Ukrainians as part of their cultural and historical heritage. This state, ruled by the Rurik dynasty, was one of the most powerful in medieval Europe before its fragmentation in the face of the Mongol invasions. The question of who the true heirs of Kievan Rus are remains a point of historical and political contention to this day. Vladimir Putin, in various pronouncements, has argued that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, historically united, a view that many Ukrainian and Western historians vehemently contest. Over the following centuries, the territory that today constitutes Ukraine was divided and dominated by various powers. The western part was under Polish-Lithuanian rule, developing cultural and religious connections with Central and Western Europe. The eastern part, including the Donbass region and Crimea, was gradually absorbed by the Russian Empire. This historical division left deep marks on Ukrainian society, creating cultural, linguistic, and religious differences that persist to this day. Crimea, a peninsula strategically located in the Black Sea, has a particularly turbulent history. Annexed by Catherine the Great's Russian Empire in 1783 after the Ottoman defeat at the Battle of Kozludza, the peninsula became the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet and a symbol of Russian naval power. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, in which Russia faced a coalition of Western powers, demonstrated the region's strategic importance. In 1954, in a decision that decades later would have immense consequences, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev administratively transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, a gesture then considered largely symbolic within the context of the unified Soviet Union. The Ukrainian experience under Soviet rule was marked by immense tragedies. The Holodomor, the Great Famine of 1932 to 1933, resulted in the deaths of millions of Ukrainians under Stalin's policies of forced collectivization. Many historians and the Ukrainian parliament itself consider the Holodomor a deliberate genocide against the Ukrainian people, although Russia disputes this characterization. This traumatic memory continues to fuel Ukrainian distrust of Moscow and strengthens a sense of distinct national identity. The dissolution of the Soviet Union and Ukrainian independence. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 represented one of the most transformative moments in 20th century history. On December 1st of that year, Ukraine held a referendum on independence, in which more than 92% of voters opted for separation from Moscow. This result was decisive not only for Ukraine but for the very fate of the Soviet Union, as it demonstrated that even a republic so historically and culturally integrated with Russia wished to follow its own path. In the following years, independent Ukraine faced the challenge of defining its identity and geopolitical position. The country inherited the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal, a remnant of the Soviet era. In 1994, through the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine agreed to transfer all its nuclear weapons to Russia in exchange for security guarantees from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. This agreement promised to respect Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, commitments that would be flagrantly violated 2 decades later. Relations between Kiev and Moscow during the 1990s were complex but generally functional. Russia, under Boris Yeltsin, was absorbed in its own internal problems and chaotic economic transition. Ukraine navigated between the desire for closer ties with the West and the need to maintain cordial relations with its powerful neighbor, on which it depended for energy supplies, especially natural gas. The issue of the Black Sea Fleet based in Sevastopol, Crimea, was resolved through lease agreements that allowed Russia to maintain its naval presence on the peninsula. During this period, NATO began its eastward expansion process, incorporating former Warsaw Pact members and former Soviet Baltic republics. Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary joined in 1999, followed by Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in 2004. This expansion was viewed with growing apprehension by Moscow, although Russia initially cooperated with the alliance through the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997 and the NATO-Russia Council established in 2002. Ukraine maintained a policy of non-alignment but cultivated increasingly close relations with Western structures. In 1994, it became one of the first countries to join NATO's Partnership for Peace. In 1997, it signed the charter on a distinctive partnership with the alliance. However, Ukrainian public opinion remained divided regarding formal NATO membership, especially in the eastern and southern regions of the country, where cultural and linguistic ties with Russia were stronger. The Orange Revolution and its consequences. The year 2004 marked a turning point in contemporary Ukrainian history. That year's presidential election pitted Viktor Yanukovych, a pro-Russian politician from the Donetsk region openly supported by the Kremlin, against Viktor Yushchenko, a pro-Western reformist. The campaign was marked by dramatic events, including Yushchenko's dioxin poisoning, which left his face permanently disfigured. Yushchenko would later accuse Russian agents of the attack. When official results declared Yanukovych the winner amid widespread evidence of electoral fraud, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians took to the streets of Kiev in peaceful protests that became known as the Orange Revolution, a reference to the color of Yushchenko's campaign. For weeks, protesters camped out in Maidan Nezalezhnosti Square, Independence Square, in the heart of the capital. The Supreme Court of Ukraine annulled the results and ordered a new vote, in which Yushchenko emerged victorious. For Moscow, the Orange Revolution was interpreted as one of the so-called color revolutions that swept through the post-Soviet space during that period, including the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003. The Kremlin viewed these movements not as genuine expressions of democratic aspiration, but as operations orchestrated by the West, particularly the United States, to weaken Russian influence in its immediate neighborhood. This perception would profoundly shape Russian foreign policy in the following years. The Yushchenko government actively pursued Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration. However, the NATO summit in Bucharest in April 2008 revealed Western divisions on this issue. While the United States, under the George W. Bush administration, supported granting the accession action plan to both Ukraine and Georgia, Western European countries, led by Germany and France, opposed it, fearing to provoke Russia. The result was an ambiguous statement asserting that both countries will become NATO members at some point in the future, without establishing a concrete timetable or mechanism. Putin, present at the summit as a guest, expressed strong opposition. In private conversations with Western leaders, he reportedly even questioned the legitimacy of Ukraine's very existence as an independent state. A few months later, Russia demonstrated its willingness to use military force to maintain its regional influence by invading Georgia in August 2008, effectively occupying the separatist regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The Western response was limited. Setting a worrying precedent, the return of Yanukovych and the Euromaidan crisis. Despite the hopes placed in the Orange Revolution, the following years brought disillusionment for many Ukrainians. Yushchenko's presidency was marked by internal political conflicts, economic difficulties, and accusations of corruption. In the 2010 presidential election, Viktor Yanukovych obtained his revenge, winning the second round against former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko in a vote considered free and fair by international observers. The Yanukovych government adopted a balanced stance between the West and Russia, but gradually leaned towards Moscow. In 2010, the Ukrainian parliament passed a law abandoning aspirations for NATO membership and reaffirming the country's non-aligned status. However, negotiations with the European Union for an association agreement and a deep and comprehensive free trade area progressed over several years. The association agreement promised greater economic integration with Europe, democratic reforms, and access to the European market. For many Ukrainians, especially among the younger and more urbanized population, it represented an opportunity to escape the Russian orbit and build a more prosperous and democratic future. However, Russia saw the agreement as a direct threat to its interests and exerted intense pressure on Kiev to reject it. In November 2013, just a week before the planned signing of the agreement at a summit in Vilnius, Yanukovych surprisingly announced the suspension of negotiations. The decision provoked an immediate and massive reaction. On the night of November 21st, thousands of people gathered in Maidan Square in Kiev, inaugurating what would become known as Euromaidan, a protest movement that would last for months and fundamentally transform Ukraine. Initially, the protests focused on the European question, demanding that the government resume the path of integration with the EU. However, as the weeks passed and the government responded with increasing repression, the demands broadened to include an end to corruption, respect for human rights, judicial reform, and eventually, Yanukovych's resignation. Maidan Square became a permanent encampment, with barricades, tents, communal kitchens, and even an improvised library. The movement transcended traditional political divisions, uniting nationalists and liberals, young and old, Ukrainians from different regions and linguistic backgrounds. In January 2014, the government passed draconian laws criminalizing various forms of protest, further intensifying tensions. Violent clashes between protesters and the Berkut riot police became frequent. In February, the situation escalated dramatically. Between February 18th and 20th, more than 100 protesters were killed, most by snipers positioned in buildings around the square. These victims would later be known as the Celestial Century, martyrs of the so-called Revolution of Dignity. Under international and domestic pressure, Yanukovych signed an agreement brokered by European foreign ministers on February 21st, promising early elections and constitutional reforms. However, that same night, the president fled Kiev, eventually reappearing in Russia. The following day, the Ukrainian parliament voted to remove him from office, with support even from members of his own party. An interim government was formed, and early presidential elections were scheduled for May. The annexation of Crimea, February to March 2014. The Russian response to Yanukovych's downfall was swift and decisive. While events were still unfolding in Kiev, soldiers without insignia began appearing in Crimea. These armed men, equipped with modern Russian weaponry and military vehicles but lacking any national identification on their uniforms, became known as Little Green Men. Russia initially denied any involvement, claiming they were local self-defense militias, a lie Putin would later admit in a television interview. On February 27, armed men occupied the Crimean parliament and the regional government building in Simferopol. Under the cover of arms, a new government was installed, led by Sergei Aksyonov, leader of a fringe pro-Russian party that had garnered only 4% of the vote in the last regional election. Ukrainian military forces on the peninsula, including the naval base in Sevastopol, were quickly surrounded and isolated. Most Ukrainian soldiers chose not to resist, given the overwhelming numerical and logistical superiority of the Russian forces. On March 16, a referendum was held in Crimea, asking residents whether they wished to join the Russian Federation. Local authorities claimed that over 96% voted in favor of annexation, with an 83% turnout. However, the referendum was widely condemned by the international community as illegal and fraudulent. It was held under military occupation, without adequate independent observers, without a free campaign. And only 3 weeks after the start of the crisis. The Ukrainian constitution itself required that any territorial change be approved by a nationwide referendum. On March 18, Putin signed the treaty annexing Crimea to the Russian Federation in a ceremony at the Kremlin, an act that the vast majority of the international community considered a flagrant violation of international law, including the UN Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, and the Budapest Memorandum itself, which Russia had signed in 1994. The UN General Assembly passed a resolution declaring the referendum invalid and affirming the territorial integrity of Ukraine, with 100 votes in favor, 11 against, and 58 abstentions. For Putin, the annexation was presented as the redress of a historical injustice, the reunification of artificially separated Russian lands. He argued that Crimea had always been part of Russia at its heart and in its culture, and that its transfer to Ukraine in 1954 had been a mistake. For Ukraine and the West, it was an act of aggression unprecedented in post-Cold War Europe, the first forced annexation of territory since World War II. Guerra no Donbass, 2014 to 2022. While Crimea was being absorbed by Russia with relatively little violence, a very different situation was developing in eastern Ukraine. The Donetsk and Luhansk regions, collectively known as Donbass, were the most industrialized and Russian-speaking in the country. There was a significant population there that culturally identified with Russia and viewed the new government in Kiev with suspicion, particularly nationalist elements present in the Euromaidan movement. In April 2014, pro-Russian armed groups began seizing government buildings in several cities in Donbass. Unlike Crimea, where Russian forces acted in a coordinated and professional manner, the situation in Donbass was more chaotic, involving a mix of local militias, Russian volunteers, intelligence agents, and ideologically motivated adventurers. Among the prominent leaders were Igor Girkin, a Russian FSB intelligence officer who used the codename Strelkov, and Pavel Gubarev, a local Russian nationalist activist. On May 11, referendums were held in parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, proclaiming the creation of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. Like the Crimean referendum, these were widely condemned as illegitimate.
Vitals are dropping.
The crucial difference was that, while Russia formally annexed Crimea, it kept the Donbass republics in a legal limbo, only recognizing them as independent states years later. In 2022, the Ukrainian government, now led by interim President Alexander Turchinov and later by President-elect Petro Poroshenko, launched an anti-terrorist operation to regain control of the separatist regions. Fighting was intense, particularly during the summer of 2014, when Ukrainian forces appeared poised to defeat the separatists. However, direct Russian military intervention, including the deployment of regular troops and heavy equipment across the border, reversed Ukrainian gains and inflicted devastating defeats, particularly at the Battle of Ilovaisk in August. A tragically symbolic event occurred on July 17, 2014, when Malaysia Airlines flight MH17, traveling from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, was shot down over separatist-controlled territory, killing all 298 passengers and crew on board. A subsequent international investigation concluded that the plane was brought down by a Russian-launched Buk surface-to-air missile operated by a Russian military unit. Russia has consistently denied responsibility, but the incident intensified Western sanctions and solidified the image of the separatists as dangerous. In February 2015, after intense fighting and another major Ukrainian defeat at Debaltseve, the Minsk II agreement was signed, mediated by France and Germany, with the participation of Ukraine and Russia. The agreement stipulated a ceasefire, the withdrawal of heavy weapons, constitutional reforms guaranteeing autonomy to the separatist regions, and eventually the restoration of Ukrainian control over the international border. However, the implementation of the agreement proved impossible, with both sides accusing the other of violations and differing interpretations regarding the sequence of measures to be taken. The conflict in Donbass then transformed into a static trench war, often compared to conditions during the First World War. The line of contact stabilized approximately where it was in February 2015, with sporadic ceasefire violations but no major territorial shifts. Over the next 8 years, more than 14,000 people died, including approximately 3,400 civilians. Millions were displaced from their homes. The infrastructure of the affected regions was devastated. The climbing years, 2019 to 2021 inches 2019, Ukraine elected a new president under extraordinary circumstances. Volodymyr Zelensky, a 41-year-old comedian and actor with no prior political experience, defeated incumbent Petro Poroshenko by a landslide with 73% of the vote. Zelensky had starred in a popular television series, Servant of the People, in which he played a history teacher who accidentally becomes president and fights corruption. His campaign, conducted primarily through social media, promised a new approach to Ukrainian politics and the peaceful resolution of the conflict in Donbass. Born in Kryvyi Rih, an industrial city in south-central Ukraine, into a Russian-speaking Jewish family, Zelensky represented a Ukraine different from the traditional political elite in Kiev. His election demonstrated the maturity of Ukrainian democracy and the population's desire for change. However, hopes for a quick solution to the conflict with Russia would soon prove illusory. During this period, relations between Ukraine and NATO continued to deepen. In 2017, the Ukrainian parliament reinstated NATO membership as a strategic foreign policy objective. In 2019, a constitutional amendment enshrined the country's Euro-Atlantic aspirations. NATO intensified its cooperation with Kiev, providing training, equipment, and conducting joint military exercises. For Moscow, these developments represented an existential threat, bringing the Western military alliance closer to its borders. The COVID-19 pandemic, which dominated global attention in 2020, did not prevent the continued deterioration of Russian-Ukrainian relations. In the spring of 2021, Russia conducted a massive military deployment near the Ukrainian border, the largest since 2014. Although the troops were partially withdrawn after declared exercises, the episode signaled Moscow's intentions and tested the Western reaction. Putin has increasingly articulated his views on Ukraine. In July 2021, he published a lengthy essay entitled, On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, in which he argued that Ukrainians and Russians were one people, artificially divided, and that modern Ukraine was an artificial creation of the Soviet era. The text implicitly questioned the legitimacy of Ukrainian sovereignty and was read by many analysts as an ideological manifesto for future actions. In the fall of 2021, evidence of a new and even larger Russian military buildup began to accumulate. Satellite imagery showed tens of thousands of troops, tanks, artillery, and logistical equipment positioned in multiple locations along the Ukrainian border and in Belarus. Western intelligence services, particularly American and British, began to publicly warn that Russia was planning a full-scale invasion. In December 2021 and January 2022, Russia presented a series of demands to NATO and the United States, including a guarantee that Ukraine would never become a member of the alliance, the withdrawal of NATO forces and equipment from countries that had joined after 1997, and effectively the end of the alliance as a relevant military force in Eastern Europe. These demands were rejected by the West as unacceptable, although diplomatic negotiations continued until the eve of the invasion, February 24, 2022, the day that changed Europe. In the early hours of February 24, 2022, Vladimir Putin appeared on a televised broadcast announcing the start of a special military operation in Ukraine. In a speech laden with revisionist historical narratives and unfounded accusations, the Russian president claimed that the operation aimed to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, protect Russian speakers in Donbass from alleged genocide, and prevent the country from becoming a platform for NATO threats against Russia. He promised there were no plans to occupy the country. Minutes after the speech, cruise and ballistic missiles began striking targets across Ukraine, from Kiev to Kharkiv, from Odessa to Mariupol. Simultaneously, Russian armored columns crossed the border at multiple points, advancing from the north through Belarus, from the east from Russian territory, and from the south from Crimea. Airborne troops were launched to capture Hostomel Airport on the outskirts of Kiev in an attempt to establish a bridgehead for additional troops that would quickly decapitate the Ukrainian government. The Russian plan, as later revealed by captured documents and intelligence analysis, envisioned a swift and decisive victory. Moscow apparently expected the Ukrainian armed forces to collapse, that the Russian-speaking population would welcome the liberators with open arms, and that the Zelensky government would flee or be quickly replaced by a more friendly regime. These expectations proved spectacularly wrong. Ukrainian resistance was fierce from the very beginning. The airborne troops at Hostomel were counterattacked and prevented from consolidating their position. The Ukrainian Air Force, reported as destroyed in the early hours by Russian propagandists, continued operating and contesting the airspace. Most importantly, the Ukrainian people demonstrated a determination and unity that surprised observers worldwide. Volodymyr Zelensky emerged as an unlikely but extraordinarily effective wartime leader. Refusing American offers of evacuation with a phrase that would become iconic, "I need ammunition, not a ride," he remained in Kiev, regularly appearing in videos broadcast directly from his position in the besieged capital. His direct communication, often in Ukrainian, Russian, and English, mobilized not only his own people but international public opinion. In the first few weeks, Russian forces advanced rapidly on some fronts, but faced serious logistical problems. The famous military column of more than 60 kilometers heading towards Kiev became bogged down in congested roads, with vehicles running out of fuel and being attacked by Ukrainian ambushes. The northern offensive, which was supposed to capture Kiev in a matter of days, stalled in the suburbs of the capital. The atrocities of Bucha and the siege of Mariupol in mid-March 2022, it became clear that the Russian plan for a swift capture of Kiev had failed. By the end of the month, Russia announced it would significantly reduce its military operations around the capital, focusing on liberating Donbass. In reality, this was a forced retreat in the face of Ukrainian resistance and Russian losses. When Ukrainian forces retook the suburbs of Kiev in early April, the world was confronted with evidence of mass atrocities. In the city of Bucha, civilian bodies lay in the streets, many with their hands tied behind their backs in signs of summary execution. Mass graves were discovered. Survivors recounted stories of torture, rape, and systematic murder during the Russian occupation. The images from Bucha shocked the global conscience. International investigators, including teams from the International Criminal Court, began documenting what appeared to be war crimes and possible crimes against humanity. Russia denied any responsibility, claiming the scenes had been staged by Ukraine, a claim contradicted by forensic evidence, satellite imagery, and testimony from multiple independent sources. Similar atrocities, though on a smaller scale, have been documented in other formerly occupied areas, including Irpin, Hostomel, and towns in the Kharkiv region. Meanwhile, in the southeast, the port city of Mariupol became the scene of one of the war's most devastating battles. With a pre-war population of approximately 430,000, Mariupol was surrounded by Russian and separatist forces early in the invasion. The Ukrainian defenders, including members of the controversial Azov Brigade and Marines, resisted fiercely but were gradually squeezed into an ever-shrinking perimeter. The siege of Mariupol lasted almost 3 months, during which the city was subjected to constant bombardment. Thousands of civilians died, including hundreds in the attack on the Mariupol Drama Theater on March 16, whose parking lot had the word "children" written in giant letters visible from the air. Humanitarian conditions deteriorated catastrophically, with shortages of water, food, medicine, and electricity. The last Ukrainian stronghold was the gigantic Azovstal steelworks, an industrial complex with extensive underground tunnels where soldiers and civilians, including women and children, took refuge for weeks. In mid-May, following orders from the Ukrainian High Command, the remaining defenders surrendered to Russian forces. More than 2,000 soldiers were taken prisoner, many of whom would remain in Russian captivity for long periods, some later exchanged in prisoner-of-war agreements. The fall of Mariupol was a significant tactical victory for Russia, establishing a land corridor between Russian territory and occupied Crimea. However, the cost was immense. The city was in ruins, its population displaced or dead, and the prolonged resistance had immobilized Russian forces that could have been employed on other fronts during crucial weeks of the Battle of Bakhmut, the longest and bloody. With the failure of the northern offensive, the war focused on eastern and southern Ukraine. Russia redefined its objectives, focusing on the complete liberation of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. In July 2022, Russian forces captured the city of Lysychansk, completing the occupation of the entire Luhansk Oblast. Attention then turned to the Donetsk Oblast, where the city of Bakhmut would become the epicenter of one of the bloodiest battles since World War II. Bakhmut, a mining and industrial city with a pre-war population of about 70,000, did not possess exceptional strategic significance. Its importance lay more in its symbolic value and the fact that it controlled communication routes to other cities in Donbass. The battle for this city lasted approximately 9 months, from August 2022 to May 2023, consuming immense amounts of lives and resources on both sides. A central player in the Battle of Bakhmut was the Wagner Group, a Russian private military company commanded by Yevgeny Prigozhin, an oligarch close to Putin known as the Kremlin Cook, for his catering contracts with the government. Wagner already operated in several African countries and the Middle East, but in Ukraine it assumed an unprecedented role, functioning almost as a parallel army to the regular Russian forces. Prigozhin recruited tens of thousands of prisoners from Russian penitentiaries, promising amnesty in exchange for 6 months of service. These men were unleashed against Ukrainian positions at Bakhmut in human waves reminiscent of tactics from a century ago. The casualties were catastrophic. Estimates suggest that the Wagner Group lost between 20,000 and 30,000 fighters at Bakhmut, most of them prisoner recruits. Ukrainian forces also suffered heavily. The decision to defend Bakhmut at all costs was controversial even within the Ukrainian military command. Some argued that resources would be better employed preparing counteroffensives in other sectors. Others maintained that defending Bakhmut disproportionately depleted Russian forces and bought valuable time. General Valery Zaluzhnyi, commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian forces, and his staff maintained the defense, turning the city into a meat grinder that consumed Russian units. In May 2023, after the near-total destruction of the city, the Wagner Group declared the capture of Bakhmut. Prigozhin celebrated the victory with videos in which he harshly criticized the Russian Ministry of Defense for alleged lack of support. Tensions between Wagner and the regular military establishment had been building for months, with Prigozhin accusing Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov of incompetence and even treason. The Wagner Group rebellion, June 2023. The most extraordinary internal episode of the war occurred on June 23 and 24, 2023, when the Wagner Group rebelled against the Russian military command. Claiming that its forces had been attacked by Russian missiles, Prigozhin declared a "march of justice" against the military leadership in Moscow. Columns of Wagner fighters crossed from Ukraine into Russia, taking the city of Rostov-on-Don, headquarters of the Southern Military District and Command Center for Operations in Ukraine. From Rostov, Wagner's forces advanced north toward Moscow, covering hundreds of kilometers virtually unopposed. The speed of the advance and the apparent inability of Russian security forces to respond exposed a shocking vulnerability at the heart of Putin's power system. For a few hours, the regime seemed genuinely threatened. Putin appeared on television condemning the rebellion as treason and promising punishment. However, in a surprising turn of events brokered by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, the march was aborted. An agreement was announced whereby Prigozhin would leave for Belarus, the criminal charges against him would be dropped, and the Wagner fighters could choose between joining the regular forces or accompanying their leader. The peaceful resolution of the crisis seemed a humiliation for Putin, who had promised harsh justice just hours before. However, the story would not end there. On August 23, 2023, exactly 2 months after the rebellion, a private jet carrying Prigozhin and several Wagner leaders mysteriously crashed near Moscow, killing everyone on board. Investigators pointed to evidence of an explosion aboard the aircraft. Few doubted that it was an execution ordered by the Kremlin, although Russia denied any involvement. Prigozhin's death effectively ended Wagner as an independent force. Its operations in Ukraine were absorbed by regular forces. Its contracts in Africa were gradually taken over by other entities linked to the Russian state. The episode revealed fissures in the Russian power system, but also demonstrated the regime's capacity to re-establish control through brutal methods. Ukrainian counteroffensives of 2022 and 2023. Despite the enormous difficulties faced, Ukraine demonstrated a counteroffensive capability that surprised military observers worldwide. In the autumn of 2022, Ukrainian forces launched two significant operations that dramatically altered the map of the conflict. In September 2022, a lightning offensive in Kharkiv Oblast caught Russian forces completely by surprise. In a matter of days, the Ukrainian army liberated approximately 12,000 square kilometers of territory, including important cities such as Izium and Kupiansk, which had served as Russian logistical hubs. The speed of the Russian collapse indicated serious morale, command, and logistical problems within the invading forces. Simultaneously, but using different methods, a counteroffensive in the south targeted the Kherson region. This more methodical operation initially focused on destroying Russian logistics, particularly the bridges over the Dnipro River. Deprived of adequate supplies and reinforcements, Russian forces on the west bank of the river found themselves in an untenable position. In November 2022, Russia ordered the evacuation of Kherson, the only regional capital it had captured, making it the first major city recaptured by Ukraine. However, the 2023 counteroffensive yielded more modest results. Announced months in advance and awaited with great expectations, the operation aimed to break through Russian defenses in the south and potentially reach the Sea of Azov, cutting off the land corridor to Crimea. Ukraine received significant Western equipment, including German Leopard tanks and American Bradley tanks, and trained entire brigades in NATO countries. The offensive, launched in June 2023, confronted extensive minefields, multiple trench lines, and Russian defenses far better prepared than the previous year. The advance was slow and costly. In 6 months of intense fighting, Ukrainian forces liberated approximately 14 villages and a few hundred square kilometers, well short of the expected objectives. The village of Robotyne, which became a symbol of the struggle, was captured only after weeks of intense fighting. The relative failure of the 2023 counteroffensive fueled debates about Ukrainian strategy, the adequacy of Western support, and the long-term prospects of the conflict. Critics pointed out that Ukraine had not received the amount of equipment or air support necessary for a classic breakthrough operation. Proponents argued that the offensive had at least prevented Russia from launching its own operations and significantly depleted its forces. The expedition in Kursk, August 2024, is one of the most audacious operations of the war. On August 6, 2024, Ukrainian forces crossed the international border and invaded the Kursk region, in Russian territory. For the first time since World War II, a foreign army occupied Russian soil in a conventional military operation. The operation was planned in absolute secrecy, surprising not only Russia but apparently also some Western allies. In the first few days, Ukrainian forces advanced rapidly, capturing dozens of settlements and hundreds of square kilometers of Russian territory. The local population, unprepared for war, largely evacuated or came under Ukrainian control. The strategic objectives of the incursion were the subject of debate. Some argued that it aimed to create a bargaining chip for future negotiations, demonstrating that Ukraine could also occupy Russian territory. Others saw it as an attempt to force Russia to withdraw troops from the front line in Donbass to defend its own territory. Zelensky stated that the operation aimed to create a buffer zone to protect Ukrainian border towns from constant Russian bombardment. Initially, Russia appeared caught off guard, and its response was slow. However, over the following months, Russian forces gradually counterattacked. The military situation in Kursk fluctuated, with Ukrainian forces retaining some territorial gains while losing others.
Hang in there.
The incursion demonstrated Ukrainian offensive capabilities but also exposed limitations in resources and personnel. At the same time, Russia intensified its own offensive in Donbass, taking advantage of the diversion of Ukrainian troops to Kursk. Cities like Avdiivka fell to Russian forces, and pressure on Pokrovsk and other locations increased. The decision to launch the incursion into Kursk while facing pressure in the east remains controversial among military analysts. The internationalization of the conflict, the Russia-Ukraine war, quickly took on global dimensions, involving actors far beyond the direct belligerent parties. The West, led by the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom, mobilized an unprecedented package of economic sanctions against Russia and military assistance to Ukraine. The sanctions were the most comprehensive ever imposed on a major economy. They included freezing hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian central bank reserves held abroad, excluding Russian banks from the SWIFT system for international transfers, bans on the export of critical technology, and personal sanctions against Russian oligarchs and officials. The European Union, heavily dependent on Russian gas, embarked on a massive effort to diversify its energy sources. The impact of the sanctions on the Russian economy was significant, though not catastrophic as some initially predicted. The ruble temporarily devalued, then artificially recovered through capital controls. Inflation increased. Access to Western technological components was severely restricted, affecting everything from automobile production to the manufacture of advanced weaponry. However, the Russian economy demonstrated greater resilience than expected, partly due to high oil prices and a reorientation of trade towards China, India, and other countries that did not adhere to the sanctions. Western military assistance to Ukraine evolved dramatically throughout the conflict. Initially limited to defensive systems such as Javelin anti-tank and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, aid expanded to include long-range artillery, HIMARS rocket systems, main battle tanks, armored vehicles, and eventually F-16 fighter jets. The total value of military assistance exceeded $100 billion, with the United States as the largest contributor, followed by European countries. On the Russian side, military cooperation with other countries also intensified. Iran supplied thousands of Shahid drones, renamed Garin by Russia, which became an important weapon in attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure. North Korea emerged as a supplier of artillery ammunition, helping to offset Russian consumption that far exceeded domestic production capacity. The most significant development in internationalization was the direct involvement of North Korean troops. In 2024, intelligence reports and subsequent confirmations indicated that thousands of North Korean soldiers were sent to Russia, first for training and then for active combat, particularly in the Kursk region. Estimates suggested that up to 30,000 North Koreans could eventually serve alongside Russian forces, representing the first large-scale foreign military participation in support of Russia. The human cost, refugees, casualties, and devastations in the war triggered a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented proportions in Europe since World War II. In the first weeks after the invasion, millions of Ukrainians fled the country in an exodus of unprecedented speed and scale. Poland, Moldova, Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia received waves of refugees that overwhelmed their reception capacities. Throughout the conflict, it is estimated that approximately 6.5 million Ukrainians sought refuge abroad, while another 3.7 million remained internally displaced within the country. European countries granted temporary protection to Ukrainian refugees through an EU mechanism activated for the first time, allowing access to work, education, and social services. The international response was remarkably generous. Although tensions arose in some host countries as the war dragged on, the number of military casualties is difficult to determine precisely, as both sides treat casualties as sensitive information. Western estimates, citing intelligence sources, suggest that Russia has suffered between 150,000 and 200,000 dead and hundreds of thousands wounded since the start of the invasion in 2022. Independent organizations such as Mediazona, working with obituary records and other open sources, have confirmed by name more than 163,000 Russian deaths as of January 2026. Ukrainian casualties were also severe, although generally estimated to be lower than Russian casualties. President Zelensky mentioned in 2025 that 400,000 Ukrainians had been killed or wounded. Other estimates placed the number of Ukrainian military deaths between 60,000 and 140,000. The disparity in estimates reflects the fragmented nature of information in war zones and the interests of both sides in manipulating perceptions. Civilian casualties, documented by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission, exceeded 13,000 confirmed deaths by mid-2025, although the actual number is certainly much higher, especially considering areas under Russian occupation where verification is impossible. Russian attacks against civilian infrastructure, including power grids, heating facilities, and water supplies, have caused immense suffering, particularly during the harsh Ukrainian winters. Entire cities were reduced to ruins. Mariupol, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Volodar, and dozens of other towns suffered destruction comparable to European cities bombed in World War II. The World Bank estimated that rebuilding Ukraine would cost hundreds of billions of dollars, a burden the country could not bear alone and which would depend on long-term international commitments. War crimes and international justice. From the early days of the invasion, documentation of potential war crimes began to accumulate. The International Criminal Court opened an investigation and, in March 2023, issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin for the alleged illegal deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. Reports indicated that thousands of children had been removed from orphanages and families in occupied territories and transferred for adoption in Russia, a practice that could constitute genocide under the 1948 Convention. The ICC also issued warrants against Russia's Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova, who had publicly participated in adoption ceremonies for Ukrainian children. Subsequently, other Russian officials were similarly charged. Although Russia does not recognize the court's jurisdiction and is unlikely to hand over the accused, The warrants have practical consequences, restricting Putin's ability to travel to countries that recognize the ICC. Ukraine, supported by international partners, has developed extensive capacity for documenting war crimes. Ukrainian prosecutors have initiated thousands of investigations. Forensic teams have worked at atrocity sites such as Bucha and Izium. Survivor testimonies have been systematically collected. Cooperation with the ICC and with judicial systems of other countries has allowed some cases to be prosecuted outside Ukraine under the principle of universal jurisdiction. Accusations against Russian forces include summary executions of civilians and prisoners of war, systematic torture in detention centers, sexual violence as a weapon of war, deliberate attacks against civilian infrastructure, use of prohibited munitions in populated areas, and forced deportation of populations, particularly children. Reports from the UN and human rights organizations have documented consistent patterns of abuse in occupied territories. Ukraine also faced allegations of violations, although on a much smaller scale. Videos showing the apparent execution of Russian prisoners circulated on social media. The Ukrainian government promised to investigate such incidents. The asymmetry in documentation partly reflects the access of journalists and investigators to the different territories, but also fundamental differences in the conduct of the belligerent forces. The role of information and propaganda. The Russia-Ukraine war is often described as the first major conflict of the social media age, where the battle for narrative is fought as intensely as battles on the field. Both sides mobilized sophisticated communication apparatuses, albeit with different methods and audiences. Ukraine, particularly through Zelensky and ministers like Deputy Prime Minister Mikhailo Fedorov, demonstrated mastery in the use of digital platforms. Zelensky's speeches to foreign parliaments via video conference, daily messages on social media, and a coordinated campaign to maintain international attention proved extraordinarily effective. The image of a democratic and courageous Ukraine resisting authoritarian aggression resonated deeply with Western audiences. Russian propaganda, in turn, operated on multiple fronts. Domestically, state media presented the war as a defensive operation against NATO, portrayed the Ukrainian government as a Nazi and American puppet, and downplayed or denied atrocities committed by Russian forces. Censorship intensified dramatically, with the criminalization of any reference to the operation as a war and the blocking of independent media. Thousands of Russians were arrested for protesting against the war or even for holding blank placards. Internationally, Russia sought to amplify narratives that undermined support for Ukraine, that NATO had provoked the conflict through its expansion, that Western aid only prolonged the suffering, that sanctions harmed the West more than Russia, and that the solution necessarily involved recognizing territorial realities. These narratives found receptivity in certain political circles, particularly at the extremes of the ideological spectrum on both the right and the left. Disinformation was a constant weapon. False claims about American biological laboratories in Ukraine, about dirty bombs that Kiev supposedly planned, about genocide of Russian speakers in Donbass, circulated widely. Social media platforms struggled, with varying degrees of success, to contain the spread of false content. Fact-checking became an industry in itself. Peace negotiations and future prospects. Throughout the conflict, several attempts at negotiation were made, without lasting success. In the first weeks after the invasion, Russian and Ukrainian delegations met in Belarus and later in Turkey. Reports suggest that a draft agreement was discussed in Istanbul in March 2022, involving Ukrainian neutrality, international security guarantees, and possibly some kind of solution for the occupied territories. However, negotiations collapsed. Ukraine argues that the discovery of Bucha's atrocities made it impossible to negotiate with Russia while the latter occupies Ukrainian territory. Russia claims that the West, particularly the United Kingdom through then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, pressured Kiev to reject any agreement. The truth likely involves multiple factors, including growing Ukrainian confidence after initial defensive successes and Russian intransigence regarding territorial demands. The official Ukrainian position crystallized in Zelensky's peace plan, presented in 10 points in November 2022. This plan demands the complete restoration of Ukrainian territorial integrity, including Crimea and Donbass, the withdrawal of all Russian forces, accountability for war crimes, robust security guarantees, and compensation for the destruction caused. Russia rejected these conditions as unrealistic. With the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States in November 2024, a new dynamic was introduced into the prospects for negotiation. Trump had promised during the campaign to resolve the war quickly, although the methods remained vague. His administration, which took office in January 2025, initiated intense diplomatic contacts with both sides. As of January 2026, when this narrative is produced, trilateral negotiations between the United States, Ukraine, and Russia are ongoing, with meetings held in Abu Dhabi. Reports indicate that elements of a potential agreement are being discussed, including territorial issues, security guarantees, and monitoring mechanisms. President Zelensky mentioned that 90% of a potential agreement had been defined, although the remaining 10%, presumably involving territory, are the most difficult. Russia continues to insist that any agreement must recognize its territorial annexations, that Ukraine must remain outside NATO, and that Western forces and armaments must be limited in the country. Ukraine, supported by European allies, resists ceding territory conquered by force and insists on security guarantees to prevent future aggression. Strategic analysis and military lessons. The Russia-Ukraine war offers profound lessons about the nature of contemporary conflict. Military analysts worldwide study its battles, tactics, and technologies, drawing conclusions for future doctrines. One of the most evident lessons was the enduring importance of conventional artillery and ammunition. Despite the advanced technologies available, the war largely became a duel of attrition where the ability to produce and fire artillery shells proved decisive. Both sides faced critical ammunition shortages at different times, exposing the inadequacy of Western reserves and Russia's dependence on external suppliers such as North Korea. Drones have emerged as revolutionary tools on the battlefield. Inexpensive and widely available systems, from modified commercial quadcopters to specialized kamikaze drones, have transformed target detection and engagement. Tanks and armored vehicles, once dominant, have proven vulnerable to drones equipped with grenades or anti-tank munitions. The transparency of the battlefield has increased dramatically, making it difficult for either side to move significant forces undetected. Trench warfare has returned on a scale not seen since World War I. Extensive systems of fortified defenses, minefields, and obstacles have demonstrated that defense retains significant advantages over offense when both sides possess comparable technology. The 2023 Ukrainian offensive illustrated the difficulty of penetrating prepared defenses without air superiority or adequate suppression capabilities. Hybrid warfare, combining conventional military operations with cyber attacks, information warfare, and economic pressure, has proven central. Russia has employed all these dimensions, albeit with varying effectiveness. Cyber attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure have had a limited impact, partly due to Western preparedness and assistance. Information warfare has been more effective domestically than internationally. For NATO, the war validated certain doctrinal premises while questioning others. The alliance rediscovered the importance of territorial defense and ammunition stockpiles after decades focused on expeditionary operations. Finland and Sweden joined the alliance, significantly expanding their border with Russia, the exact opposite of what Putin claimed to seek by invading Ukraine. Global impacts and the future of the international order. The Russia-Ukraine war far transcends the borders of the two belligerent countries, reverberating throughout the international system with consequences not yet fully understood. The conflict represents a fundamental challenge to the rules-based order built after the Second World War, particularly to the principles of territorial sovereignty and the prohibition of the use of force to resolve disputes. For Europe, the war forced a profound reassessment of the security assumptions that had guided policies since the end of the Cold War. Germany announced a Zeitenwende, a turning point, abandoning decades of military restraint and dramatically increasing its defense spending. European countries accelerated plans to reduce their energy dependence on Russia. The European Union assumed an unprecedented role in defense matters, coordinating military assistance and acquiring weapons jointly for the first time in its history. The implications for the global order are equally profound. The war exposed the fragility of the UN's collective security system, where the Russian veto in the Security Council prevents any effective action. It demonstrated that major powers remain willing to use military force to expand territory, challenging assumptions that such behavior belonged to the past. It accelerated the fragmentation of the world into blocs, with Western democracies on one side and an authoritarian axis centered on Russia and China on the other. For China, the war presented complex dilemmas. While maintaining close ties with Russia and refraining from condemning the invasion, Beijing also benefits from the existing international order and observes with interest how the West responds to territorial aggression, presumably with implications for its own plans regarding Taiwan. The declared, unbounded partnership between Xi Jinping and Putin weeks before the invasion became somewhat awkward as Russian difficulties mounted. The Global South, a broad term encompassing developing countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, has shown reluctance to clearly align itself with either side. Many countries maintained trade relations with Russia, abstained from UN votes, and resisted Western pressure to impose sanctions. This neutrality reflected pragmatic economic interests, historical resentment of what they perceive as the Western double standard, and a reluctance to be drawn into great power conflicts. What's at stake? Projections and scenarios. As we contemplate the future of this war, several scenarios present themselves, each with distinct implications for Ukraine, Russia, and the world. Uncertainty remains high, as the outcome depends on variables including Ukrainian resistance, the sustainability of the Russian effort, the level of Western support, and the political choices of leaders in multiple capitals. One scenario involves negotiations resulting in some form of ceasefire or armistice, freezing the front lines roughly where they are. This outcome would leave Russia occupying approximately 19% of Ukrainian territory, including all of Crimea, most of Donbass, and parts of the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. Ukraine would retain its sovereignty over the remainder, presumably with security guarantees and prospects for European integration. This scenario resembles what occurred in Korea in 1953, an armistice without a formal peace treaty that persists to this day. Another scenario envisions the continuation of the conflict for several more years at a reduced intensity, a slow war of attrition where neither side manages to achieve a decisive victory. This outcome would be devastating for Ukraine, which endures destruction on its territory, and costly for Russia, which loses resources and lives. It would depend on the West's ability and willingness to maintain assistance over time and on Ukraine's internal resilience. A third scenario, less likely but not impossible, involves significant escalation. This could include the use of tactical nuclear weapons by Russia, a development Putin has hinted at as a possibility in the event of an existential threat to the regime. It could also involve direct confrontation between Russian and NATO forces, should some incident or miscalculation escalate out of control. Finally, scenarios of collapse on either side remain theoretically possible. A Ukrainian collapse, resulting from military exhaustion or failure of Western support, would lead to the total or partial subjugation of the country. A Russian collapse, while seemingly distant, cannot be entirely ruled out, considering the internal tensions exposed by the Wagner rebellion and the accumulated stress on the economy and society. Lessons for humanity. The Russia-Ukraine war offers grim but important lessons about human nature, international politics, and the fragility of peace. It demonstrates that large-scale warfare remains possible between modern states, that technological progress has not eliminated the brutality of combat, and that international systems designed to prevent conflict can fail when major powers choose to ignore them. The courage and resilience of the Ukrainian people will be remembered as one of the most inspiring chapters in contemporary history. Faced with an invasion by a much larger military power, ordinary citizens became soldiers, entire cities resisted, and a nation discovered an identity and determination that few anticipated. Zelensky, the comedian-turned-wartime leader, embodies this unlikely transformation. On the other hand, war exposes the persistence of imperial impulses, the willingness of leaders to sacrifice tens of thousands of lives for territorial or ideological objectives, and the vulnerability of civilian populations caught between forces they do not control. The ruins of Mariupol, the bodies of Bucha, the children deported to Russia, are testaments to humanity's capacity for cruelty. The international response, though imperfect, also offers notes of hope. The mobilization of aid to Ukraine, the welcoming of refugees, and the investigation of war crimes demonstrate that international norms are not entirely empty and that the global community can, under certain circumstances, unite in defense of principles. NATO's expansion, far from being weakened by the war, was reinvigorated by it. The Russo-Ukraine war is not yet over as these words are written. Its outcome remains uncertain, its consequences are still unfolding, and its final place in the history books will be determined by future events. What we can say for sure is that this conflict has already transformed Europe, redefined global power relations, and irreversibly affected millions of lives. For Ukraine, regardless of the final territorial outcome, the war consolidated a national identity forged in the fire of combat. The Ukrainian choice to resist, when many predicted rapid collapse, demonstrated that the destiny of nations is not determined solely by correlations of brute force, but also by will, leadership, and values. The Ukraine that will emerge from this war, whatever its territorial configuration, will be fundamentally different from the one that existed before February 24, 2022. For Russia, the war represents a gamble whose final results are still uncertain. If Putin sought to prevent NATO expansion and keep Ukraine within the Russian orbit, he achieved exactly the opposite. NATO expanded, Ukraine moved irreversibly closer to the West, and Russia became more dependent on China and isolated from much of the world. The cost in lives, resources, and international reputation is immense. Only time will tell if any territorial gains will compensate for these losses. For the world, the war serves as a brutal reminder that history has not ended, that conflicts between great powers remain possible, and that the rules-based international order requires active defense. The 21st century will not be the period of perpetual peace that some imagined at the end of the Cold War. The lessons of democracy, resilience, and international solidarity demonstrated by the response to the invasion of Ukraine deserve to be remembered and applied to the future challenges that will inevitably come. We have reached the end of this journey through the history of the Russo-Ukrainian War. If this content has contributed to your understanding of the events that shaped and continue to shape our world, I ask that you consider subscribing to this channel to follow our future videos on history, geopolitics, and the major events that define our time. Share this video with colleagues, students, teachers, and all those who seek to understand the contemporary world with depth and rigor. History is not just the study of the past, it is the fundamental tool for navigating the present and preparing for the future. Thank you for your attention throughout this narration. May historical knowledge illuminate our path in times of uncertainty, and may we learn from the tragedies of the present to build a more peaceful future. Until the next video.